Did medieval women just take it, silently enduring whatever came their way? Were they always powerless victims, waiting for a knight or a miracle? From the 5th to the 15th century, the reality was far more intricate than that. Number 1, Misconception 5, resistance was always unsuccessful or immediately crushed. A common thought is that any flicker of independence or defiance by medieval women was swiftly extinguished, that their efforts were pointless, their voices silenced forever in a patriarchal world. This perspective paints a picture of unending defeat, where male authority always triumphed without question, leaving no lasting impact from women's struggles. It suggests that women's actions, even those of courage or cunning, led only to their downfall or to the reinforcement of the very systems they sought to challenge. The narrative often assumes that if a woman dared to step outside the prescribed roles, she faced immediate, overwhelming repercussions, ensuring that no meaningful change could ever arise from her individual or collective acts. This idea implies a monolithic, unbreakable patriarchy that crushed all dissent, leaving no room for subtle shifts, partial victories, or the accumulation of small gains over time. It suggests that women's resistance was futile, a mere historical footnote, rather than a dynamic and sometimes impactful force. The idea of constant failure also overlooks the quiet, enduring nature of some forms of resistance, which might not have brought about dramatic societal shifts, but instead secured personal autonomy, protected familial interests, or carved out spaces of influence within existing structures. This misconception fails to acknowledge that success can be defined in many ways, beyond outright revolution or the overthrow of established power. It discounts the resilience of individual women and communities who, despite immense pressure, found ways to persist, to maintain their dignity, and to leave a mark, however small, on the fabric of their times. Consider the case of the Beguines, religious women who lived in semi-monastic communities across northern Europe from the 12th century onwards. These women chose to live a life of piety without formal vows or strict cloistering, setting themselves apart from traditional monastic orders. They often supported themselves through weaving, teaching, or nursing, creating self-sufficient enclaves that operated outside the direct control of male ecclesiastical hierarchies. Despite facing suspicion and even persecution from church authorities, who viewed their independent spiritual lives as potentially heretical, Beguine communities endured for centuries. For example, the Great Beguinage of Leuven in Belgium, established in the 13th century, continued to house Beguines until the 20th century. While they were not overtly challenging the church's doctrine, their very existence represented a form of quiet, persistent resistance to the limited options available to women. They carved out a space for spiritual autonomy and intellectual pursuits, providing women with a degree of freedom and education that was largely inaccessible elsewhere. The fact that many Beguine communities thrived, accumulating property and influence, even in the face of papal bulls and inquisitorial scrutiny, demonstrates that resistance was not always immediately crushed. Their resilience allowed generations of women to live fulfilling lives on their own terms, contributing to spiritual literature and social welfare, despite the prevailing patriarchal norms that sought to confine women to either marriage or traditional enclosed convents. The existence and longevity of these communities, according to historical studies, show that women could indeed forge successful paths of self-determination, even if those paths were constantly scrutinized and sometimes threatened. Their success was not a dramatic overthrow, but an enduring persistence in living a life that defied conventional expectations for women of their time. Another example can be found in the legal strategies employed by women to protect their property and rights within the existing legal frameworks. While medieval law was often biased against women, many women, particularly those of means, learned to navigate its complexities. They engaged in lawsuits, petitioned courts, and strategically used marriage contracts and wills to safeguard their inheritances, dowries, and children's futures. For instance, detailed records from English common law courts reveal numerous instances where women successfully sued to reclaim dower rights, challenged fraudulent land transfers, or protected their marital property from their husbands' creditors. The actions of women like Alice Chaucer, Duchess of Suffolk, in the 15th century illustrate this tenacity. Alice, through astute legal maneuvering and the use of patronage networks, managed to retain vast estates and political influence after her husband's death, navigating complex legal challenges to ensure her son's inheritance and her own continued autonomy. Her success was not a dismantling of patriarchy, but a strategic use of its own rules to her advantage, ensuring her wealth and power endured. This wasn't an isolated incident. Countless women from various social strata engaged in similar, albeit smaller scale, legal battles. Though they might not have changed the laws for all women, their individual victories created precedents, contributed to the gradual evolution of legal interpretations, and importantly, secured their own economic independence and personal standing. These legal battles, often long and arduous, were not always lost. According to legal historians, women frequently won these cases, demonstrating that the judicial system, while flawed, offered avenues for resistance and, at times, for securing favorable outcomes for women. Consider the powerful influence of aristocratic women as patrons of arts and literature. Women like Marie de France in the 12th century or Yolande of Aragon in the 15th century used their wealth and status to commission works that sometimes explored themes of female agency, virtue, and even critique of societal norms. And Marie de France's Les, often featuring strong female characters who navigate complex romantic and social dilemmas, subtly challenge prevailing notions of female submission. Yolande of Aragon, a formidable political figure in her own right, supported writers and artists, influencing the cultural output of her court. While these women operated within the constraints of their social standing, their patronage allowed for the creation and dissemination of narratives that presented alternative visions of womanhood, fostering a cultural space where female voices and perspectives could gain a platform. This was not overt rebellion, but a successful, enduring form of resistance through cultural influence. The manuscripts they commissioned and the literary works they supported sometimes survived centuries, shaping later understandings of women's capabilities and roles. Their investments in literature and art provided a lasting legacy, proving that even indirect forms of resistance could have enduring cultural impact, influencing thought and expression far beyond their own lifetimes. Scholars of medieval literature often point to the significant role played by these female patrons in shaping the literary landscape and preserving stories that valued female intellect and independence. Finally, the very survival of women's voices, despite attempts to silence them, represents a form of enduring success. Women like Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century English mystic, dictated her autobiography, The Book of Marjorie Kempe, a remarkable account of her spiritual visions, pilgrimages, and struggles against social pressures and accusations of heresy. Though she faced intense scrutiny and was often ridiculed, her unwavering conviction and determination ensured her story was recorded. The very existence of her book, one of the earliest autobiographies in English, is a testament to her successful resistance against efforts to dismiss her experiences or to conform to societal expectations of female piety. Similarly, Christine de Pizan, an early 15th century writer, actively defended women and challenged misogynistic literature in her works, such as The Book of the City of Ladies. She argued for women's intellectual capabilities and highlighted their contributions to society. Despite living in an era where women's literary voices were often marginalized or dismissed, Christine de Pizan achieved widespread recognition in her time, and her writings continued to be read and influential for centuries. The fact that her works were copied and circulated widely demonstrates a sustained impact, proving that women could achieve literary success and challenge dominant narratives, leaving a lasting intellectual legacy that defied attempts to relegate women solely to domestic or subordinate roles. The persistence of these women's written words, through the careful work of scribes and later printers, against a backdrop of widespread illiteracy and limited access to education for women, is a clear indicator that their resistance, though intellectual, was not without its long-term victories and enduring influence. Number 2, misconception for resistance was primarily against physical violence. Many people believe that medieval women's resistance, if it existed at all, was primarily a response to physical abuse or direct bodily harm. This narrow view assumes that women's struggles were largely confined to defending themselves from domestic violence or sexual assault. It suggests that their forms of protest or defiance were almost always reactive, focusing only on the most egregious and visible forms of patriarchal oppression. This perspective overlooks the multifaceted nature of the constraints placed upon medieval women and the diverse ways in which they resisted those constraints. It reduces their struggles to a single dimension, ignoring the profound impact of economic, social, legal, and intellectual forms of subjugation. The idea that women only resisted physical violence also implies a reactive, rather than proactive, approach to their lives, suggesting they only fought back when directly attacked, rather than actively challenging the systemic injustices that shape their daily existence. This misconception fails to acknowledge that patriarchy manifested in numerous, often subtle, ways beyond physical harm, impacting women's property rights, their access to education, their freedom of movement, their right to choose a spouse, and their ability to participate fully in economic and civic life. By focusing solely on physical violence, this view risks minimizing the broader spectrum of resistance strategies employed by women, which encompassed everything from legal challenges to spiritual autonomy, from economic independence to cultural expression. It also ignores the reality that many forms of control were non-violent but equally oppressive, such as forced marriages, limitations on inheritance, or the suppression of female voices in public discourse. To truly understand medieval women's resistance, one must look beyond the immediate and visible acts of violence to the deeper, pervasive structures of control and the varied, often subtle, ways women pushed back against them. Consider the pervasive economic restrictions placed upon women and their resistance to them. In many regions, women's ability to own, inherit, or control property was severely limited, especially after marriage, where their assets often became their husband's property. Yet women actively resisted these economic constraints. For example, in towns and cities, married women, known as feme sole merchants in some English legal contexts, were able to conduct their own businesses independently of their husbands. This legal status, granted in certain boroughs like London, allowed them to buy and sell goods, enter contracts, and even incur debts in their own names. This was a crucial means for women to maintain economic autonomy and provide for themselves and their families independent of their husband's financial decisions or misfortunes. Records show women engaging in various trades, from brewing and baking to silk weaving and haberdashery, accumulating wealth and operating their own shops. These actions were a direct challenge to the patriarchal norm that sought to subsume a woman's economic identity within that of her husband. Their success in these ventures demonstrates a form of resistance not against physical violence, but against economic subjugation, allowing them to secure financial independence and sometimes even support their male relatives. This wasn't about fending off a physical attack, but about securing one's livelihood and social standing through economic means, a quiet but powerful act of defiance against a system designed to limit their financial agency. Legal historians have documented numerous examples of women successfully claiming and maintaining the status, thereby creating a significant loophole in otherwise restrictive property laws. Another significant area of resistance not involving physical violence was against the social and legal constraints surrounding marriage and reproductive control. For many medieval women, marriage was not a choice but an economic or political arrangement made by their families, often without their consent. Women resisted forced marriages through various means. Some sought refuge in convents, claiming a religious calling as a way to avoid an unwanted union. Others, particularly in the later Middle Ages, used canon law, which required mutual consent for a valid marriage, to challenge or annul forced engagements. There are documented cases of women appealing to ecclesiastical courts, arguing that they had not freely consented to their marriage. For instance, in 14th century France, records show women successfully challenging their marriages on grounds of coercion or pre-existing contracts, thereby regaining their freedom. Beyond marriage, women also found clandestine ways to resist patriarchal control over their bodies and reproduction. While information is scarce due to its clandestine nature, historical evidence suggests the use of abortifacients and contraceptive methods, often passed down through generations of female knowledge, to limit family size or avoid unwanted pregnancies. These practices, though risky and often condemned by the Church, represented a form of quiet, personal resistance to patriarchal demands for prolific reproduction and control over female bodies. This was not about physical defense, but about asserting agency over one's own life path and reproductive choices, even in the face of strong religious and societal pressures to conform. Social historians and medical historians have unearthed fragments of evidence from medical texts, legal records, and folklore that hint at the widespread knowledge and use of such methods, however dangerous. Furthermore, women resisted the intellectual and educational suppression prevalent in medieval society. Access to formal education for women was generally limited to noble women and those entering religious orders, while the vast majority of women remained illiterate. Yet, many women actively sought knowledge and literacy, either through self-education, private tutors, or within accessible religious communities. Christine de Pizan, mentioned earlier, is a prime example. She was a professional writer and intellectual who, after being widowed, supported her family through her literary work. She not only wrote extensively, but also engaged in public debates, challenging prominent misogynistic texts of her time. Her very existence as an educated, financially independent female author was a form of resistance against the idea that women were intellectually inferior or incapable of contributing to scholarly discourse. Similarly, within convents and beguinages, women compiled libraries, engaged in scholarly pursuits, and produced their own theological and literary works. For instance, the Abbess Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century composed theological treatises, scientific works, and musical compositions, demonstrating profound intellectual capabilities and artistic talent. She corresponded with popes and emperors, asserting her prophetic authority and wisdom. These women were not resisting physical threats, but the systemic denial of intellectual opportunities and the widespread dismissal of female intelligence. Their pursuit of knowledge and their contributions to literature, philosophy, and spirituality were powerful acts of defiance against an intellectual patriarchy that sought to silence or diminish women's voices. The works of these women, now studied by modern scholars, stand as enduring proof of their successful intellectual resistance. Finally, women resisted the imposition of strict social norms and expectations regarding their behavior and public presence. While women were generally expected to be modest, obedient, and confined to the domestic sphere, many defied these expectations in subtle and overt ways. Records of medieval urban life, for instance, show women actively participating in markets, engaging in public disputes, and even appearing in court as witnesses or litigants. The phenomenon of scolding women, who publicly criticized and shamed men or other women, was a recognized, albeit often punished, form of female vocalization and social policing. While a woman might be put in a ducking stool for scolding, the very existence of such practices indicates that women were indeed speaking out, challenging male authority, and asserting their presence in the public sphere, even if it came with social consequences. This was not a physical fight, but a battle over social space and acceptable forms of female expression. In another vein, women's participation in popular religious movements and heresies also represented resistance to social control. Women were often prominent in movements like the Cathars or the Lollards, where they could achieve a degree of spiritual authority and equality often denied in orthodox religious institutions. For example, some Cathar communities allowed women to become perfects, leaders with significant spiritual authority, a role unheard of in the mainstream church. Their involvement in these movements, while sometimes leading to persecution, was a conscious choice to defy mainstream societal and religious norms, asserting their right to spiritual agency and alternative forms of community. These acts were not about fending off blows, but about claiming social space, asserting their voices, and defining their own paths, a broad range of resistances that went far beyond mere physical defense. Number 3. Misconception 3. Resistance was always collective and organized. A common assumption about medieval women's resistance is that it must have been a highly organized, collective effort, resembling modern social movements or political parties. This view often imagines women gathering in large groups, formulating strategies, and openly challenging patriarchal structures through coordinated actions. It suggests that any significant pushback against male dominance would have required a unified front, a shared ideology, and formal leadership, similar to a guild or a peasant revolt. This perspective tends to overlook the reality of medieval life, where communication was difficult, travel was restricted, and opportunities for large-scale female gatherings were rare and often suppressed. It also ignores the inherent dangers and limitations placed on women, which made overt, organized rebellion a perilous and often impossible undertaking. The misconception fails to recognize that much of medieval resistance, particularly for women, occurred on a smaller, more intimate scale, often within the household or local community, and frequently involved individual acts of defiance rather than a grand, collective strategy. It implies that unless resistance could be documented as a mass movement, it was ineffective or non-existent. This narrow definition of resistance misses the myriad of informal, subtle, and often isolated actions through which women asserted their agency, protected their interests, and challenged the status quo. It overlooks the power of individual choices, quiet defiance, and informal networks that might not appear in official records, but were nevertheless crucial in shaping women's lives and pushing back against oppression. Consider the countless individual acts of legal resistance undertaken by women to protect their rights and property. While there might not have been a women's rights movement in the medieval sense, individual women frequently engaged with the legal system, which was complex and often biased against them. They brought lawsuits concerning inheritance, dower rights, breach of promise of marriage, and even cases of domestic abuse. For example, in the court records of medieval England, particularly in ecclesiastical courts, there are numerous instances of individual women petitioning for divorce or separation, often citing cruelty or adultery by their husbands. These were not collective actions. Each woman embarked on a solitary, often courageous, legal battle to secure her personal freedom or economic security. A woman like Agnes Paston, a 15th century gentrywoman, tirelessly managed her family's estates, engaged in numerous lawsuits to protect her children's inheritance, and dictated extensive correspondence that reveals her shrewd legal mind and independent decision-making. Her actions, while undoubtedly supported by family and legal counsel, were ultimately individual efforts to assert her rights within a male-dominated legal framework. These solitary legal struggles, though not part of an organized movement, represent a persistent form of resistance, demonstrating individual agency and a refusal to passively accept injustice. Legal scholars have extensively documented these individual cases, showing that women were far from passive when their rights or property were threatened. Another powerful form of individual resistance was through spiritual autonomy and personal piety. Many women, particularly in the later Middle Ages, sought direct relationships with the divine, often through mystical experiences or intense devotion, which sometimes put them at odds with established church authority. Marjorie Kempe, a laywoman from Norfolk, England, is a prime example. Her spiritual life was intensely personal, marked by visions, weeping, and a determination to live a life of chastity despite being married and having 14 children. She embarked on extensive pilgrimages and publicly narrated her spiritual experiences, often facing ridicule, skepticism, and accusations of heresy from both clergy and lay people. Her decision to live a life dictated by her personal spiritual convictions rather than conforming to societal or ecclesiastical expectations was a profound act of individual resistance. She was not part of an organized group challenging the church, rather, she carved out her own unique path, asserting her individual spiritual authority. Similarly, the anarchist Julian of Norwich, a solitary mystic, wrote Revelations of Divine Love, a profound theological work based on her own visions. Her decision to live an enclosed, contemplative life and to document her theological insights was an individual pursuit that contributed significantly to medieval Christian thought, defying the expectation that women's religious roles were limited to communal monasticism or domestic piety. These women, through their solitary spiritual journeys, asserted their intellectual and spiritual agency without the need for collective action. Religious historians often highlight these women as examples of individual strength and intellectual independence within the confines of medieval religious life. Furthermore, subtle, everyday acts of defiance within the household and community constituted a form of individual resistance that rarely involved overt organization. Peasant women, for instance, often controlled the household economy, managing resources, food preparation, and childcare. While these roles were prescribed, women could exert significant influence and even resist male authority through subtle means, withholding labor, selective obedience, or using gossip and social networks to challenge male reputations. A wife might nag her husband, a widely recognized form of female power in the household, influencing decisions through persistent persuasion. Or, a woman might subtly mismanage her husband's property, or fail to complete tasks, thereby undermining his authority without overt confrontation. While difficult to document, these forms of resistance are alluded to in popular literature, legal records detailing domestic disputes, and advice manuals of the time which often warned men about the difficulties of controlling their wives. These were not actions planned by a committee, but individual responses to the constraints of daily life. Even more profoundly, women practice individual forms of self-care and control over their bodies. For example, the use of folk medicine, herbal remedies, and clandestine methods of contraception or abortion, often passed down through female networks, were highly individualized acts of resistance against patriarchal control over reproductive rights and health. These were private, often secret decisions made without any formal organization, yet they empowered individual women to exert agency over their own bodies and futures. This kind of resistance, while not collective, was widespread and deeply significant for individual women's lives. Finally, even within traditional female roles, women demonstrated individual resistance through the performance of their duties. For example, a midwife, though fulfilling a socially recognized role, held significant power and knowledge that was uniquely female. She could choose to assist women in difficult circumstances, offer advice on fertility and contraception, or even subtly challenge male medical authority. Her actions were often independent, based on her personal judgment and accumulated wisdom, rather than dictated by an organized professional body. Similarly, female artisans, such as brewers, bakers, or textile workers, often managed their own businesses and apprentices. While they might have belonged to guilds, their daily decisions about production, sales, and labor management were individual acts of economic agency. A female brewer who consistently produced high-quality ale and managed her finances skillfully was subtly resisting the stereotype of female incompetence and demonstrating her individual economic prowess. These acts, though seemingly ordinary, were individual assertions of competence and autonomy within male-dominated fields. The cumulative effect of thousands of such individual decisions and actions, while not centrally organized, slowly chipped away at the notion of female passivity and created spaces for individual women to thrive and assert their independence in ways that were often subtle but ultimately enduring. These individual successes, documented in guild records and court proceedings, show that women could and did achieve economic independence and professional standing through their own efforts. Number 4, misconception 2, resistance only happened through overt rebellion or political power. Many tend to think that if medieval women resisted patriarchy, it must have been through grand, visible acts like leading armies, ruling kingdoms, or open rebellion. This belief assumes that resistance only counts when it takes a form recognizable as power in a modern male-centric political sense. It conjures images of Joan of Arc or powerful queens, suggesting that only women at the very top of the social hierarchy, or those who broke dramatically with gender norms, could possibly challenge patriarchal structures. This narrow focus overlooks the vast majority of medieval women, who lived far from royal courts or battlefields, and for whom overt rebellion would have been unthinkable or suicidal. It ignores the myriad of subtle, covert, and everyday forms of resistance that were crucial for women's survival and agency. The misconception fails to appreciate that power and resistance manifest in diverse ways, especially for marginalized groups, and that a lack of dramatic public confrontation does not equate to a lack of agency or defiance. It implies that unless women were wielding swords or scepters, they were utterly without influence or means of pushing back. This perspective also risks dismissing the significance of personal autonomy, economic independence, spiritual freedom, and intellectual pursuits as valid forms of resistance, simply because they do not fit a predetermined mold of political action. To limit resistance solely to overt rebellion or political power is to erase the ingenuity, resilience, and quiet strength of countless medieval women who found ways to navigate, subvert, and challenge the patriarchal systems that govern their lives, often without ever holding official power or engaging in public revolt. Consider the powerful forms of resistance found in spiritual and intellectual realms, which did not involve political power or overt rebellion. Many women, particularly in religious orders or as lay mystics, found ways to assert their agency and challenge male authority through spiritual authority. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, is a profound example. While she was an abbess, her power was derived from her spiritual visions and theological writings, not from political office or military might. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings, often admonishing them for their failings, and her spiritual authority was widely recognized even by powerful men. She founded her own convents, managed their finances, and oversaw their intellectual life, all based on her perceived divine revelations. Her resistance was intellectual and spiritual. She asserted women's capacity for profound theological insight and spiritual leadership in a world that largely denied it. Similarly, the Beguines, independent religious women across northern Europe from the 12th century, lived semi-monastic lives without formal vows, supporting themselves through their labor. Their communities, like the Great Beguinage of Ghent, provided women with an alternative to marriage or traditional enclosed convents, offering a degree of autonomy and intellectual freedom. Their existence, often despite church suspicion and persecution, was a quiet but persistent form of resistance to patriarchal control over women's spiritual lives and choices. They were not leading armies, but they were creating and sustaining independent communities that defied traditional norms for women, showcasing a form of resistance that was enduring and profound without being overtly political. Another crucial area of resistance lay in economic autonomy and the skillful navigation of the medieval economy by women from various social strata. This form of resistance was largely decentralized and often individual, not an organized rebellion. In towns, women were actively involved in commerce, often as femmes seules merchants, as mentioned earlier. These women ran their own businesses, managed apprentices, and engaged in trade, accumulating their own wealth independently of their husbands. For example, in medieval London, women were prominent in trades such as brewing, baking, textile production, and even as pawnbrokers. Their ability to earn and control their own income provided a powerful degree of independence and agency, challenging the notion that women were solely dependent on male providers. This was not a political act, but a pragmatic one that allowed women to secure their livelihoods and, in some cases, support their families or become significant economic figures in their own right. Even in rural areas, peasant women played vital roles in the agricultural economy, managing dairies, gardens, and livestock, and contributing significantly to the household income. Their essential labor and management of resources were not political acts, but they represented a form of economic power that allowed them to resist complete subjugation, giving them a voice and influence within the household and local community that was often overlooked in formal records. The economic agency of these women, recognized by economic historians, was a form of resistance that was subtle, pervasive, and often incredibly effective in carving out spaces of independence without resorting to any form of overt rebellion or political maneuver. Consider also the numerous instances of legal resistance, where women used existing legal frameworks to protect their rights, property, and personal autonomy. These were not acts of political power or rebellion, but rather strategic engagements with the very system that often sought to limit them. Women regularly appeared in secular and ecclesiastical courts to assert their dower rights, challenge disputed inheritances, or seek legal separations or annulments from abusive or unfaithful husbands. And for instance, court records from medieval France and England contain numerous examples of women successfully suing their male relatives or even their husbands to protect their property or persons. A notable example is that of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who famously sought an annulment from Louis VII of France on grounds of consanguinity. While Eleanor was a queen, her method was legal, not martial, and reflected the broader pattern of women using legal avenues to escape unwanted unions or assert their rights. Even less prominent women used these channels. A woman might petition a local court for protection against a violent husband, or sue to recover property wrongly taken from her. These legal battles, often arduous and expensive, were individual acts of defiance, demonstrating a profound understanding of legal systems and a determination to use them to one's advantage. They highlight that resistance could be found in the intelligent and persistent navigation of existing structures, rather than solely in their overthrow. Legal scholars have compiled extensive data showing the frequency and success of women's legal actions, providing a rich picture of their agency. Finally, consider the subtle acts of social resistance and reputation management engaged in by women. In a society where reputation was everything, women often used gossip, social networks, and public shaming to exert influence or resist male authority. While not political or rebellious, these acts shaped public opinion and could undermine the authority of men who mistreated women or violated social norms. A woman might spread rumors about an abusive husband, thereby damaging his social standing and potentially prompting intervention from his family or community. This informal social power, though difficult to quantify, was a real and effective means of resistance. Furthermore, within popular culture, such as medieval fabliaux and tales, there are countless stories of cunning wives outwitting their foolish or tyrannical husbands, often through wit, deception, or manipulation. While fictional, these narratives reflect a cultural recognition of women's ability to resist male authority through means other than overt confrontation, providing a blueprint for subtle defiance. These cultural forms of resistance, though not involving political power or organized rebellion, were vital in challenging patriarchal assumptions and empowering women to find agency within their constrained lives. The prevalence of such stories, analyzed by literary historians, suggests a cultural outlet for frustrations and an imagined space where women could achieve a form of victory without resorting to force. These examples clearly show that resistance was far broader than just overt rebellion or direct political power. Number 5, Misconception 1. Medieval women were entirely passive victims with no agency. One of the most persistent and damaging misconceptions about medieval women is the idea that they were entirely passive, silent victims, utterly without agency or control over their own lives. This view paints a picture of women as uniformly oppressed, completely submissive to male authority, and incapable of independent thought or action. It suggests that they had no voice, no power, and no means to resist the patriarchal structures that defined their existence. This misconception often arises from focusing solely on prescriptive texts written by men, such as legal codes or religious sermons, which often dictated ideal female behavior. It ignores the vast discrepancies between what was prescribed and what was actually practiced in daily life. This simplified narrative dismisses the complexities of medieval society, where women occupied diverse roles and found varied ways to exert influence, make choices, and even challenge the status quo. The idea of total passivity fails to acknowledge the resilience, ingenuity, and sheer determination of women who navigated difficult circumstances, protected their interests, and contributed actively to their families, communities, and economies. It glosses over the crucial roles women played in agriculture, craft, production, trade, household management, and religious life, roles that inherently involve decision-making and agency. To accept this misconception is to deny historical women their humanity and to flatten a rich tapestry of experiences into a single sorrowful image of helplessness, obscuring the many forms of resistance, both subtle and overt, through which they asserted their will and shaped their destinies. Consider the active roles women played in the economic life of medieval towns and villages, demonstrating significant agency in various trades and crafts. In many urban centers, women were not confined to the home. They worked as brewers, bakers, textile workers, innkeepers, street vendors, and even as skilled artisans in specialized guilds. For instance, in Paris, women dominated the silk weaving industry. Records from the 13th century indicate that female silk workers had their own guilds, such as the maîtresses, alvières de soie, and mistresses of silk work, which allowed them to control their own production, train apprentices, and manage their businesses independently. These women were not passive laborers, they were entrepreneurs and skilled craftswomen who wielded economic power and contributed significantly to the urban economy. Their ability to operate businesses, manage finances, and participate in formal economic structures directly challenges the notion of complete passivity. These women made decisions about their products, their employees, and their markets, exercising a level of agency that was crucial for their livelihoods and their standing in the community. Their economic activity often provided them with a degree of financial independence, allowing them to support themselves and their families, even if their husbands were absent or impoverished. The detailed guild records and urban censuses from various European cities provide ample evidence of women's active and crucial participation in these economic roles. Furthermore, women demonstrated significant agency within the legal system, often navigating complex legal procedures to protect their rights and property. While medieval law was generally patriarchal, it did offer avenues for women to seek justice and assert their claims. Women frequently appeared in local, manorial, and ecclesiastical courts as litigants, witnesses, and even occasionally as attorneys or arbitrators. For example, in England, women routinely initiated lawsuits to reclaim dower rights after their husbands' deaths, to challenge fraudulent land transfers, or to prosecute cases of defamation. Records from the Court of Arches, an ecclesiastical court in London, show numerous women petitioning for annulments or separations from their marriages on grounds such as coercion, impotence, or cruelty. These were not passive acts, but deliberate, often courageous engagements with a formal system to achieve specific outcomes that benefited the women involved. A woman like Matilda of Canossa, a powerful 11th century Italian noblewoman, famously ruled vast territories, commanded armies, and mediated conflicts between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. While her power was exceptional, it illustrates that women, given the circumstances, were capable of wielding immense political and military agency, directly challenging the notion of inherent passivity. Even women, without such high status, made their voices heard in legal settings, demonstrating a keen understanding of their rights and the means to pursue them. Historians of medieval law have extensively documented these cases, providing clear evidence of women's active participation in legal processes. Consider also the agency women exercised within the religious sphere, often finding spaces for self-determination and influence outside traditional patriarchal structures. From powerful abbesses managing vast monastic estates to individual mystics who challenged ecclesiastical authority, women used religion as a pathway to agency. Abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen, mentioned earlier, not only administered large and wealthy convents, but also corresponded with powerful secular and spiritual leaders, offering advice and even admonition based on their spiritual authority. These women commanded significant resources, managed complex institutions, and fostered intellectual and artistic communities. They were far from passive, they were leaders, scholars, and spiritual guides. Beyond the formal institutions, the Beguines, independent religious women living in communities across Europe, chose a life of piety outside traditional monastic vows. They supported themselves through various crafts like weaving and created spaces for spiritual and intellectual autonomy. Their very existence in communities like the Great Beguinage of Bruges was an act of agency, a deliberate choice to live outside prescribed norms for women. Even individual laywomen like Marjorie Kempe asserted remarkable spiritual agency through their mystical experiences and pilgrimages, often defying social expectations and clerical control. These women navigated complex social and religious landscapes, demonstrating profound personal conviction and an active pursuit of their own spiritual paths, despite facing skepticism and opposition. The abundant hagiographical and autobiographical texts from the period, alongside monastic records, attest to the dynamic and often influential roles women played in medieval religious life. Furthermore, women demonstrated agency in their personal lives, particularly concerning marriage and family. While many marriages were arranged, women often found ways to exert influence or resist unwanted unions. Records show instances of elopement, clandestine marriages, marriages without formal ceremony but recognized by mutual consent, or appeals to ecclesiastical courts to nullify forced engagements. A woman might use her family's connections or appeal to influential patrons to escape an unsuitable match. Even within marriage, women were not entirely powerless. They played crucial roles in household management, child rearing, and often had significant influence over domestic decisions, particularly in managing servants and daily provisions. The good wife in medieval society was a manager, an administrator, and a decision maker within her sphere. For instance, the letters of Agnes Paston reveal a strong, assertive woman who managed her family's estates, defended their property, and actively participated in legal and financial matters, often in her husband's absence or after his death. Her correspondence shows her making complex decisions and giving detailed instructions, demonstrating a high degree of agency in her domestic and economic life. Moreover, women cultivated extensive social networks through which they exchanged information, offered mutual support, and exerted influence within their communities. These informal networks provided a platform for women to share knowledge, organize informal collective action, and even spread gossip that could shape reputations and influence local power dynamics. These myriad acts, from personal decisions to broader community interactions, cumulatively illustrate that medieval women were active participants in their own lives, not mere passive recipients of their circumstances. The vast body of personal letters, household accounts, and social records from the period provide detailed evidence of women's active decision-making roles within their families and communities.